Welcome back to Ether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin and a very special guest, our first female guest on the show. In the whole World War Now extended universe, we're joined by Rachel Wilson. You probably know her from Twitter, from any number of social media appearances. She's been on the Whatever podcast. She has been on her husband's podcast, The Crucible. She's been on all sorts of places. She's been on Tim Pool. We're going to be talking about that. So I'm sure nobody in our audience needs to be introduced to her, but we are happy to be joined again, the first female guest. But unless people accuse us of simping, we're going to be coming for the ladies pretty hard today. So it all balances out in the grand scheme of things, right? But Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. For in the off chance that somebody doesn't know who you are, feel free to introduce yourself, say what you're all about, and all those good things.
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that you guys are in the clear because I got a day pass from the patriarchy to be here today. And so this is all approved by the patriarchy. So you guys should be in the clear
Hmm.
on that. Yes, my name
Glad
is
to hear it.
Rachel Wilson, and I'm a researcher, author, a mom of 5 kids. I homeschool. I'm married to a very based guy who has the most popular debate channel on the internet right now called The Crucible. That's my husband, Andrew. You've probably seen him on a bunch of things. He's also been on Whatever, Fresh and Fit, Tim Pool, a bunch of shows like that. I actually kind of got started doing this. I wrote an article about homeschooling in the pandemic, which was published to Gab. And then the producers from Tucker Carlson saw it and asked me to do a little appearance with Tucker. So that was kind of my first like major media appearance. I've done a bunch of other stuff since then. Unfortunately, I'm busy going on everyone else's shows and making content for them. So I do have my own YouTube channel. You guys can just search my name, Rachel Wilson, and it will come up. I've had some great guests on there. I do a ton of content with David Patrick Harry from Church of the Eternal Logos. I've had Jay Dyer, Jim Bob, Professor Edward Dutton, among many other fantastic people on my channel. So I've been really lucky to do some stuff on there. You can find my book, Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation, which has been a bestseller in its category for quite a while now on Amazon. If you hate Amazon, just shoot me a DM on any of the social media platforms and you can order one from me if you prefer that. And also, please check out my Substack. It's at rwilson.substack.com. And probably if you don't want to go ahead and dive into the book, that's a great place to start because I do have a lot of articles and essays about everything we're going to talk about today, feminism, where it comes from, how it became the dominant ideology, how all the impacts of it, the ramifications, how it relates to religion and philosophy, and all the reasons that we should end women's suffrage and feminism in general, and how women's liberation didn't really liberate women from anything at all and actually enslaved them. So yeah, that's my main thing that most people probably know me about is talking about that. So there you go.
That's awesome. And of course, the book Occult Feminism, I did buy the Kindle version of it, and it's quite a good read. And in fact, it isn't even too long, so the length is actually very attractive that you can just obtain the book and literally read it in a week or two, just quite casually. So
Yeah.
I would recommend people, and I'm probably going to get the hardcover copy eventually, so that's a big recommendation. But Rachel, perhaps at the end of the show, we'll ask about the book you're currently writing as well, because that one is definitely going to be a must buy. So, Cult Feminism 2, or you can reveal the name to us perhaps at the end, or perhaps the planned name. But sort of going into this discussion, I think, Orthodox Christians as well as conservative Christians around the world, we've realized a little bit too late, right, post 1960s, that something has snuck up on us, which is feminism. A lot of, say, Orthodox priests and even saints haven't even commented on this particular phenomenon throughout the last, you could say, 50 years, because it really has taken us by surprise, similar to how Marxism and took us by surprise in the early 20th century, and in the 19th century, Freemasonry kind of was this thing which we didn't realize has attached itself to a lot of our various cultures, which, but essentially Christian cultures, but has infected our societies. And feminism, in fact, has gone and like, delved so deep into our sort of conscience, and even us, most Christians have certain feminist presuppositions already built in, even men, where they feel like the woman should have, women should be working as much as men should, and they have certain false ideas about family court and about how all of that applies. And even people have ideas such as, well, abortion should be, legal, which is completely absurd. But certain people do have this approach to sort of feminist ideas, which, Rachel, I think if you could just give our listeners some understanding that exactly what feminism is and its ties to Marxism, because this is really curious. We all understand, I think a lot of our listeners understand now that communism, Marxism, these are all creations of the world elite, families related to the Rothschilds, the London Round Table, all these occult secret organizations working behind the scenes. But we now find out, especially from Rachel's book, that even a powerful family in America, such as the Rockefellers, were behind the creation of the feminist movement in the United States, and also, of course, contributed to including the Marxist ideas into that particular witch's cauldron, shall we say, which they cooked up. And now, of course, we're living with those consequences. A lot of us in the West are very negatively affected by feminism, family courts, and even the dating scene, those of us who are single. So if Rachel, if you can just quickly give us an expose of just what has taken place in the West over the last 100 years or so, I would say since maybe World War One and perhaps even World War Two, it's gotten a lot worse. And yeah, just kind of enlighten some of our listeners as well as myself and Conrad.
Yeah, sure. I love to kind of answer this broad question to start because a lot of people probably think to themselves, feminism, like, why should I really care about that with all the problems, out there? Why should I care so much about this? And the simple answer is that feminism is the greatest social revolution in all of human history. I don't think anything else even comes close, not even the industrial or technological revolutions. Those are huge and they affect every aspect of your life. Everyone understands that. But almost nobody understands how much the feminist revolution impacts every single person on every level of their life every day. So, everything about how your life works now, if you're born after 1970, which probably almost all of us listening to this are, maybe a few aren't, if you're born after 1970, certainly you were born into feminist waters. You've been swimming in them your whole life. And like a fish doesn't probably know it's in water, you probably don't realize you're swimming in feminism and that it affects everything about your life from when you get up in the morning and flip a light switch on, when you get in your car and drive to work, the way your family dynamics operate, the way your workplace dynamics operate, the way the government is run, the tax and banking systems, just everything about every aspect of your life is deeply affected by this one social revolution. And we'll get into and explain all the ways that that happens. But you have to understand this happened 100 years ago. So we've got 100 years since women's suffrage in the West, only 1 century compared to thousands of years of human history. And in just that short 100-year span, the social order, how human beings operate, how they work together, has been completely inverted from how it was just a century ago. And human beings aren't really built to handle that. It's not something that you just adapt to overnight. And we're seeing the ramifications of it from things like now every 18-year-old girl can be her own porn star through OnlyFans. Children are growing up. 41% of children are now born out of wedlock in the United States. If you go back to 1960, that number was only 5%. Also in 1960, only about 6% of children under 5 had mothers who worked outside the home full time. Now that number is, I think, 12 times as high. It's in the, 60, 70% range. So everything about everyone's life is completely different. And this woke agenda we're dealing with, everything from open borders to the woke agenda to the trans phenomenon, these things, none of them could have happened without feminism coming first. And it was the biggest thing that people don't understand about how it came to be is most people, if you just ask, they would say feminism came about as a reaction to the patriarchy oppressing women, right? That women were historically oppressed. There were all these things they couldn't do. There were all these rights that they were denied. And so at some point, for no reason at all, in the 1800s, the women looked around and said, oh no, we're oppressed. This is bad. We must do something. And so they started marching and they started organizing and they fought until they had rights. This is what you hear. And that's simply not historically factual whatsoever. In fact, prior to suffrage passing here in the United States, they did multiple referendums in multiple states across the Union. And suffrage was so deeply unpopular with women, only about 4% wanted suffrage to even be on the ballot. And they were so incredibly against it that the Women's Suffrage Union actually stopped women from being able to vote on whether they wanted to have voting rights. Yes, hear that one more time. The suffragists prohibited women from voting on whether or not they wanted voting rights. And when you read Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Joslyn Gage and Susan B. Anthony, these great figures of suffrage, in their own history of suffrage books that they wrote, they said women were the primary obstacle to getting suffrage passed. And it wasn't because they were slaves who were afraid to be freed. It really wasn't that. It was that they already felt that they had a privileged position in society, that they could do pretty much anything they wanted. Contrary to popular belief, women were allowed to be educated. They were allowed to go to school. There was never any like official restriction on that. That didn't exist. It's something that has like people have just repeated it so much that they think it's a fact. It's not. Ever since we started recording literacy rates in this country in 1790, women have had higher literacy rates than men. They've had higher high school graduation rates than men. It's true that they weren't allowed into certain universities or certain disciplines within universities for a time, but there were good reasons for that. And also, any instance you can come up with of women having some kind of right or privilege restricted or not available to them, that usually applied to men, and sometimes it was worse for the men. So men never had universal suffrage for any long period of time before women did. Most men only got the right to vote between 10 to 30 years before women did, depending on where you are. So like in the UK, I think it was 10 years. Most of the United States, it was like 30 years. Some of the territories, it was a little bit later. Some it was sooner. But no, there was this idea that all men had all rights and all power, and that they were just allowed to beat and abuse women, and that was considered fine, and women were chained to a stove, not allowed to leave the house. That's completely untrue, and I take a couple chapters in my book to debunk this idea because it's so pervasive. Every woman I talk to has this belief that she was not allowed to go to school, drive a car, that it was like Taliban Afghanistan for women in the West. And it never was. It never was. Most pubs, right, through like medieval Europe were owned by women. Like they could own property, they could do all kinds of things, they could have their own finances. The things that were restricted were usually there for a good reason. Here's an example, and then I'll kind of wrap this up. You'll always hear feminists say, but women weren't allowed to have credit cards or bank accounts until the 1970s, as though this is some self-evident example of oppression. And it's just not, because they don't tell you why. And the reason why women didn't have credit cards and bank accounts in their own name is because they were not legally allowed to be held liable for the family's debts. So you, as a woman, couldn't be sued, you couldn't be prosecuted, you couldn't be in any way held legally responsible for the financial support of your own children, of your own self, of your household. It was only men who could be held accountable for that. So often what would happen is the man would have a credit line or a credit card in his name, and the wife was an authorized user and able to shop and use the account. And this is going back to like 1800s. In old-timey Bloomingdale's in New York City, your husband could open a credit line at the store and you could go there and you could shop, but you couldn't be held responsible for the bill. Only your husband could. So these are the things that people don't ever hear. This is the way that the history has been misrepresented and twisted and sold as this garbage bill of goods, that women were historically oppressed, that men just conspired as a group to keep their boot heel on the throat of women so that they could control them and make them into slaves. And it's just simply not true. So the bulk of my work is aimed at actually giving an accurate portrayal of the history. And the reason there isn't an accurate portrayal of the history is due to something called standpoint theory, which was developed by Sandra Harding in the 60s in Nelson Rockefeller's experimental New York University, where he handpicked her and gave her a professor position at the University of Chicago, which you guys might know is a Rockefeller institution as well. And the reason they loved standpoint theory is because it went along with this like postmodernist cultural idea of everything is socially constructed. There's no objectivity. There's no reality. We can imagine it to be whatever we want it to be. And so when gender studies departments were invented in 1970 by the Ford Foundation and the Rockefellers, they set these departments up in all the big universities for the express purpose of basically rewriting the history, rewriting feminist history primarily, but also all the social history. And this is where all this critical race theory and all the other critical theory and the social construct stuff and the LGBT and the all these things we're dealing with now, it all comes from here and from feminist standpoint theory. That's where all the other stuff was developed out of, and it was definitely not accidental. It was completely on purpose. And so they're able to gatekeep and rewrite this history and portray it in the way that they want to. So that's my very long-winded explanation about what feminism is, how it got here in the West, and why. And we can go into like the motivations of these people or wherever else you guys want to go with it.
Totally, totally. That's a fantastic answer, and I think a great advertisement and pitch for people to just get your book and read the whole story and get everywhere. But we're going to try to give people, a good hour plus insight here on the show. But I have so many different ways I, want to go with this. Obviously, it's so demonic, and just seeing how, the entire, we could get into the occult element. We're definitely going to go there, but just at a basic level, I mean, it's like an alchemical transmutation of the world mind insofar as how literally just the fabric of civilization has been changed. You mentioned at the beginning what you were
Yeah.
saying, how it affects your day-to-day life. People are like, oh, well, that's an exaggeration. It's like, no, seriously, like
Yeah.
every kind of interpersonal interaction you have is tainted by this sort of warping of, look, the one thing that I'll concede to, maybe not feminists, but the reality of gender discourse is that, look, from the beginning in the garden, there's enmity between man and woman that is a byproduct of the fall. But this
Yes.
specific example we're talking about here with feminism is it's like the demonic utilizing of that opposition, of that unfortunate reality of this world, and kind of leaning into it exclusively till it completely flips on its head. And that's literally, in my mind, that's like an alchemical transmutation of just like the entire world. I know I usually use that expression talking about cosmology and what people believe now about evolution and space and these things, but it's totally
Hmm.
true when it comes to gender as well. And I don't want to get too abstract, but Rachel, I know you could talk about all of these things. The sort of destruction people talk about in sociology, specifically in the West, of the third place, of why there's all these problems with even city planning and how societies, people are becoming isolated, all of these things. I think there's no denying, if you're honest, that coincides throughout the 20th century. That phenomenon coincided with the destruction of like the male space, which was a major byproduct of feminism, which we see to this very day. And you can take any stereotypical example of why which a modern woman would roll her eyes at, for example, that men and women used to dress very differently and it was very distinct, whereas men and women would
Hmm.
go to different social clubs. They would be in different, like all sorts of areas. You could consider them almost segregated by gender. Men and women would just interact with the opposite gender on a day-to-day basis, much less frequently, even compared to, for example, their wife, or compared to how anybody interacts with anybody today. There's even in the bathrooms now. I know that's like a conservatard talking point, but like even in the bathroom, you could run into somebody with, I guess, different genitals than you. But I think this reality and destruction of just the places where men can be, and you see this trying to be infiltrated into the church, right? Of course, you go to a
Yes.
monastery, the women will be on one side of the church and men will be on the other side. You go to any parish, the only people behind the altar are going to be men, even the altar servers, let alone the deacons and the priests or a bishop or something like that. Perhaps we could talk about the deaconess issue, which is slowly but surely working its way out, the African deaconess situation in the Alexandrian Patriarchate we've talked about. But again,
Hmm.
in the church, the Orthodox Church, you will still see that sort of gender segregation, that distinction enforced, but in the world it's been totally broken down. Like the veil has been torn back almost in this very, again, demonic inversion. So perhaps without getting directly into the conversation about the occult, which I know we could spend the whole hour talking about, Rachel, I would love to just hear your comments on the destruction of the male space and what that kind of actually means for people when they go through their day-to-day life, like we kind of talked about, and why the powers that be, like you mentioned, were so intent on doing that, and how, again, the general alienation people talk about, people blame capitalism and they're partially right, or people blame this, that, or the other and they're partially right. But like, how does so much of that go back to the gender issue that we're talking about right now and feminism?
Oh, it definitely does. So I mean, yeah, it's hard to even know where to start with your daily life, but like let's just think about how much family life has changed from maybe like 1960 to now in the same time period where you had nobody balked at the idea that obviously the woman who carries the baby for 9 months nurses the baby for up to 2 years probably and does all of the infant care should obviously be the ones staying home to take care of children. And there's just so many things that were obvious to people even 50 years ago that people now haven't even ever thought of. For example, now the average American family has 1.6 kids, okay? Back then, just, even 100 years ago, it was an average of like 5 to 7. So this idea that mom was going to go have a career and the kids were going to go off to daycare never even was a thought, because, well, what would be the financial benefit of a woman working if she's got to pay for 5, 6, 7 kids to be at daycare all day? It didn't even make sense to outsource that work to some other random woman. I would argue it still doesn't make sense on multiple levels. Now children spend probably 80-90% of their day with daycare workers and public school employees and only see their parents for maybe an hour or two before they go to bed at night. And 95% of the time you will ever spend with your child as a parent is gone by the time they turn 18 and move out. So you've just taken that whole chunk of time, the only time you really get with your child, and you've outsourced it to a minimum wage daycare worker and a federal school, Department of Education employee, or a handful of them. And the mother goes off to work some corporate cubicle job in most cases. Even if the woman has a wonderful, meaningful job that she loves, she's still paying for daycare. She's still paying income tax, which plays a big role in all of this. And she is serving, her boss. That's independence. That is freedom. But when the woman is at home serving her own husband, that's slavery, right? That's oppression. It's, if you stop to actually rationally think about it for 5 seconds, it's absurd. But the problem is that there's been this giant propaganda machine running for the last 100 years through some surprising things. Like, of course, you would think, oh, radio, TV, movies, pop culture. That's pretty obvious. But a lot of people don't know that the CIA actually had a big part in pushing feminism into the culture in the 60s and 70s through Operation Mockingbird and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a Cold War effort to liberalize the West, for whatever nefarious purposes, I would say. Of course, they're going to say it's not, but I think it was pretty nefarious stuff to change and invert the culture and liberalize it for the purpose of, contrasting it against the USSR and winning the Cold War. So Gloria Steinem was recruited out of Smith College in the 60s and immediately sent to India. Now, why the hell would you send a feminist to India to push feminism? Well, while she was there for a couple of years, she worked with a woman from the Ford Foundation who kind of trained her, and she was intelligence gathering for the CIA while she was there. And India is kind of pivotal when it comes to feminism, because going all the way back to the late 1800s with Helena Blavatsky establishing theosophy there, and Annie Besant establishing a theosophy school there. And this is where the occult stuff kind of comes in, right? But all of these things, even though they were the religious occult part of it, was definitely used to push these ideologies. There was usually an element of espionage and intelligence work going on at the same time. And it was very easy to use women to push these things, because people were generally, they don't see enemies like women as enemy combatants the way they do men. So it was very easy to say, oh, she's a teacher, or she's a missionary, and so she can get into these areas and do intelligence gathering, where it's harder to do that with men. So the CIA wanted to push this feminism stuff. And so they are actually the ones that funded the first feminist magazine, Ms. Magazine, which Gloria Steinem was, the editor of. And this is where we see a bunch of propaganda start churning out in the 70s. A lot of movies, a lot of TV shows like Bewitched, the Stepford Wives. There's a whole, it's its own little class, right, of this rebellious feminist pop culture propaganda. And people don't know that that wasn't just organic. It wasn't just a reflection of how women felt at the time. It was a top-down CIA effort to push women into the workplace, to give them this impression that being at home with your family is oppressive, it's stifling, you're not free, you can't find yourself, right? So you have to go out into the workplace and have a career like Mary Tyler Moore does, or all these figures from the 70s. And it's been like that ever since. It's just accelerated since then. You cannot name a female pop star or social media influencer now who is not a strong, independent, sexually liberated goddess, right? That's where we are now. So little girls grow up thinking this, women grow up thinking this, even the men who are now being raised in large part by single moms. They spend all day at daycare with the daycare lady, and then they go to public school where they have I think it's like 90% of elementary teachers are women. And then in high schools, it's like 60, 70% of the teachers are women. And public schools are extremely gynocentric. They're very much oriented towards how little girls do things, like sit still in the desk, color code everything, all that kind of stuff. And little boys are physical and they experience the world and learn through rough and tumble play and taking things apart and putting them back together. And that's not what you do in a public school. So even the boys are being raised and to be punished for showing any sign of being masculine, any sign of being a male. And it's a big institution that basically feminizes the boys and tells them you sit still, you be quiet. The only thing that matters is being nice, right? Not being good. That doesn't matter. Being nice. It's all about the appearance and the tone. So that boys learn about tone policing even when they're growing up. So yes, every single thing about our modern life in the West is feminized. It is indoctrinated with feminism and this idea that just because women don't have the monopoly on physical force doesn't mean that they can't be strong and do everything a man can do. And actually, you should bow to her and you should worship her and you need to respect her. And if you're a man, you're bad because you're aggressive and you're a rapist and you're, like, where did all this come from, right? Where did these ideas come from all of a sudden? Well, that's kind of like what all my work is about, is where these ideas came from and why they were pushed.
I think that's very much on point, Rachel. And I do see where you mentioned the fact that, some of these early feminist, talking persons that pushed these ideas, they were obsessed with, empowering the feminine, or what they perceived as the feminine, which is in fact probably a mixed gender demonic ideology, to be honest, if demons even have genders and sexes and in that sort of spiritual realm, right? Which they do, portray themselves as Inanna, Diana, Astarte, Hecate, Lilith, who you speak about in these books, these ancient images of powerful women goddesses, etc., the Furies, right, in Greek mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they attract certain, not just females, but also males, in order to worship and venerate them as these powerful creatures who can, not non-creatures, but deities who can grant them special powers. We read about them, like, even in scripture, right? You read in book of Revelation 17:6, where Apostle John says, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, speaking about the harlot. But I think in Orthodox Christianity, we do see this almost underrepresentation of, shall we say, negative women, which I think, in terms of, like, if you think about it, the worst persons in Holy Scripture, in church tradition, typically tend to be men. For example, well, we know the Antichrist will be a man. He won't be a transgender. He won't be a lady. Caiaphas, Judas, Cain, all these negative, Herod, for example. And for women, we do have several women in, say, Scripture, like Herodias, the daughter of Herod, who's ordered for Saint John the Baptist's head to be cut off, and all these negative, the witch of
Yes.
Endor, for example. Like, there are certain, and even Delilah, who of course betrayed the forefather Samson and the judge. So there's all these there are some negative women, but that generally, I agree with you, where they were hiding behind this image of, say, innocence, or at least these feminist talking persons, and they spread their ideology through a prism of Christian culture, and I think more so corrupting it in a very antichrist type fashion. And just speaking about the occult here, we do realize that their sort of partial, maybe casual veneration of some of these ancient goddesses, ancient demonic entities, it does lead us to think about some of these previous accusations of, there were witches in the past. Even in Russian folklore, we read about Baba Yaga, women living in Russian villages in the past, pre-Christian pagan priestesses, witches, sort of oracles of sorts, who would cast spells, hexes, and essentially curse people, especially those disconnected from the church who didn't have that protection. And this led, I think, to things such as the Salem witch trials, which may or may not have been, I think, depending on the historical sort of opinion, real trials of real life witches in the Protestant United States. And today, unfortunately, Rachel, we see a re-emergence of witchcraft as this popular approach to female empowerment. It's very curious because around the world, right? And I'm not just bashing women here, so don't get me wrong. There were, of course, there were, of course, male magicians and sorcerers too. We read Saint Cyril of Jerusalem was a black sorcerer who used to sacrifice
Yes.
children, and then, of course, he confessed and became a saint and a bishop in the church. There was, of course, Simon Magus, we read about in the Book of Acts, and in the early church, there were male as well as female practices of black magic and conjuring up demons and sort of serving them. But today we notice the feminists really tried to build up that anti-Christian energy through essentially approaching witchcraft. And I see two approaches here, Rachel. There's a secular approach wherein it's the normalization of family planning, abortion, even I would say decriminalizing adultery as well in some ways, because the decriminalization of adultery in a way loosened up that family structure, which allowed, unfortunately, this inculturation of, shall we say, promiscuous culture, which I think negatively impacted women a lot more than men over the last 60 years. And then on the other side, you have a hyper occultization in a way, like a bringing back of ancient pre-Christian religions, which in fact should be, left in the history books, in fact, and like left to archaeologists to investigate. Suddenly we see entire Reddit pages appear of women hexing Vladimir Putin because of his invasion of
Yeah.
Ukraine. So it's like these people are taking
Or Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's scary. And, they claim to be hexing like members of the Taliban for abusing women and things like that. It's really bizarre. But if you can speak to that connection between the occult and feminism, I think it should be a concern for people, because we understand from scripture, from church tradition, that witchcraft, the making deals with the devil, it's not just a Faustian story. This is a real concern. And for some reason, feminism is linked at the hip to essentially black magic.
Yeah, I think that on a very basic level, the reason for that is that women are uniquely tempted to use the demonic, use magic, use ritual because of the fact that they do not have a monopoly on physical force. So if a woman feels vengeful, wrathful, jealous, wants her will and can't get it, she can't do what a man can do and raise an army or, beat someone up or use the sword or the fist to get her way. Women tend to use like subterfuge, gossip, manipulation, and when that doesn't work, they tend to go to.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this week's Ether Hour. I want to thank Rachel so much for coming on the show. Her book links and socials can all be found below, so be sure to click those, follow her everywhere. This episode, we talk about all sorts of things, the occult roots of feminism, the influence of female influencers in politics, and why all of that is wrong, all sorts of other spicy issues. So be sure to get behind the paywall, support the show, and hear all of that, as well as all 40 plus other episodes of Ether Hour that you get access to. So thanks again so much for listening, and God bless everybody. We'll see you on the other side.